Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the 2022 ASPG conference, Parliamentary Transparency, Checks and Balances, brought to you by the Victorian chapter of the ASPG and Parliament of Victoria. My name's Carolyn McVean and I'm the manager of the Victorian Parliamentary Library, and I'm also the chair of the Victorian chapter of the ASPG. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional Aboriginal owners on the land on which we are meeting. We pay our respects to them, their culture, their elders past, present and future, and elders from other communities who may be here today. Before we commence with our proceedings today, I would just like to run through some housekeeping. Just a reminder to you all that this conference is being recorded, and it was recorded yesterday and will be recorded for the next 2 days, and that's so that we can make this recording available to all participants. However, if anyone has a concern about this conference being recorded, please let me or the conference organiser know and we'll take it from there. Other housekeeping, please make sure your microphones are muted and your cameras are to remain off unless presenting. Save your questions to the end of each session and use the raise hand function when you have your question. On that note, I formally open today's proceedings and welcome Ken Coghill to start the sessions. Thank you, Ken.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. Much appreciated. Firstly, excuse my cough. Just to give a brief background to myself, I'm a member, an adjunct professor at Swinburne University, which is where I'm broadcasting from this morning. And I'm a former member of the Victorian Parliament and formerly on the staff at Monash University. So I think that that's probably sufficient from me. What I'd like to do now is to welcome and introduce our 2 guest speakers for this session, and they will have approximately 20 minutes each, followed by a period for questions and discussions. Firstly, Dr. Sarah Moulds is a senior lecturer in law at the University of South Australia. She works in justice and society and is co-founder of the Rights Resource Network South Australia. Sarah is passionate about parliaments and connecting citizens and communities with lawmakers, and her most recent book, Committees of Influence, explores the important role parliamentary committees play in rights protection in Australia. Dr. Moulds has been actively involved and engaged in local, national and international conversations about emergency lawmaking in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and the role parliaments can and should play in holding governments to account. So see that she has a very active interest and background. Rachel Tan is a research assistant and tutor at Te Pingra Faculty of Law, University of Waikato, New Zealand. She completed her LLB in 2007 at at Bond University, Australia. After working in military defence industries, IT and retail project management companies, Rachel decided to return to research in the exploration of cyber law, as that has always been her interest. She completed her LLM, First Class Honours, at the University of Waikato in 2019, after which she commenced her PhD research. She is interested in cyber law, particularly in the challenges of regulating social media. Her thesis topic explores regulating online hate speech in social media environments. Again, a really interesting background and very suitable for this morning's discussion, which is about public engagement. And what we have in these 2 papers is a really important exploration of some of the factors affecting the involvement of the community, the public, not just in the parliament, but in the democratic system, in not only our own systems, but more generally. And it's particularly apt given the events which are occurring domestically and internationally. I suppose we could start with the transition from President Trump to President Biden. We can look at the recent election of the re-elected President Macron in France. We can look at what's happening to the democratic state of Ukraine and how it is struggling to survive the onslaught from the Russian Republic, which is also claimed to be a democratic state. And of course, currently in Australia, we have the general election underway, again raising the sorts of issues that are mentioned in these two papers. So without further ado, let me invite Sarah to present her paper.
Thank you so much. Just one moment while I get my slide. Okay, just one moment. Okay, is it possible to see my slides okay now, Ken?
We can see.
Okay, great.
Yes,
thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks for that kind introduction. My name's Sarah Moulds and I work at the University of South Australia, and I join you from Kaurna country here in Adelaide and pay my respects to the Kaurna people and their elders past, present and emerging. And I'm keen to talk to you today about some of the work that came out of a discussion involving many of you actually in March of last year around this question of public parliamentary engagement and how do we improve the quality and effectiveness of the interface between the community and the parliament as an institution. And out of that discussion that happened in 2021 and that's ongoing around the parliaments in our region, there's a growing acceptance that we do want to engage and we want to engage better. And there's a growing community expectation that this is a necessary part of maintaining and rebuilding the relationships of trust between individuals and communities and democratic institutions that are designed to represent them. And we've seen that engagement techniques have become increasingly digitalised around the world and in Australia. And so often we're looking at innovations that are designed to improve the quality and efficiency of engagement through digital means. But if we want to capitalise on the benefits of different forms of engagement and avoid any potential risks, we need to better understand why it's important to connect people to our parliaments and which practices or strategies or technologies could be used to improve the quality and diversity of public engagements with parliaments in Australia and our region. And that's what some of the discussions that took place in March last year were designed to explore. And the presentation today is really designed to show you some of the outcomes of that discussion and hopefully how you might use some of those outputs in your own work, whether you're a scholar or a practitioner in a parliament. So Professor Christina Leston-Bandera, she works at the University of Leeds, and she is also involved in this group called the International Parliamentary Engagement Network. And I'm going to give a plug for that at the end because all of you are very welcome to be part of that network if you're not already. It's a group of scholars and most importantly practitioners from around the world who are interested in this idea of what it means to engage between public and parliaments. And Christina has said it in this way, that in the modern parliament, public engagement is essential for effective parliamentary scrutiny and to ensure that parliament remains relevant to our society. And so if we think about what engagement means, it can really be in the eye of the beholder and depend upon where you are in the institution and which group or publics or individual you're seeking to engage with. But if we think about engagement as being something more than just a sharing of information, and actually in a journey where the individual learns about the institution and the institution learns about the individual, we get closer to the concept of engagement that speaks to deliberation. And it's this idea of deliberative decision-making or deliberative policy-making, deliberative law-making that's become particularly important aspect or output of engagement that we want to see happen. So why do we want to engage? Because we want to improve the quality of the decision-making that happens in the Parliament and the outcomes that are produced in terms of lawmaking and policy making, as well as to build those relationships. And so deliberation requires not just an exchange of information, not just a trading off of ideas one against each other, but an active search for a common ground between different values and interests. And this involves an element of reflection on behalf of the institution and potentially an ability to change someone's position or change someone's mind. But if we want an individual outside of Parliament to engage with the Parliament, we have to empower them to do that by giving them information and understanding about what the institution is, allowing them to participate, and then showing them what their participation actually achieved, what intervention occurred, what change happened, and how do we communicate that back to the person that we're engaging with. And so these ideas were explored in that workshop that I referred to from last year, where scholars and practitioners from around the world identified some indicators of good public engagement. And these had the following features: inclusivity, diversity of participation, empowering participation, flexible, meaningful, open and transparent, and collaborative. These are words at this stage, and I hope to show you how they might be employed in a planning or evaluation technique. Importantly, it was also recognised that engagement doesn't mean asking everyone all the time what they think, but rather ensuring quality encounters and time for meaningful dialogues and exchanges with certain groups on relevant issues. And this can be challenging for highly politicised environments like parliaments, but there are a lot of local examples about this, how this is working in action. It also reminds us that when we're thinking of good quality engagement, the institution or body seeking to engage is not just sharing information and inviting participation, but is actually prepared to relinquish some control over the substantive agenda and the process of engagement. And this is perhaps the most challenging thing for an institution like Parliament, where both the substantive agenda that you're wanting to engage on and the process of engagement are extrinsically connected to the institution of Parliament. And this really was a theme that was explored in the seminar session that I was involved in yesterday, looking at committees, for example. And I think it's a theme that's running through this conference in all of the presentations. This tension, or perhaps not a tension, perhaps a strength of the Parliament around the institutional identity, which is fiercely independent, and the representative and political context in which people interact with this institution. This has an impact on engagement strategy and the quality of engagement. And it's also where learning from digital and other innovations employed by parliaments around the world can offer Australia a pathway forward to improving the quality of its engagement. So why do we want to engage better? Well, as Ken alluded to, the recent COVID-19 experience has seen a shift in the way citizens are viewing and interacting with their elected representatives. And as Evans and Stoker and other scholars like Hendricks and Kay have pointed to, it's time to ignite a national conversation about how we can bridge the trust divide between government and citizen, strengthen democratic practice, and restore confidence of Australians in the performance of their political institutions. And so we have to work out how we can reach the people that are disengaged and dissatisfied if we want to improve the overall quality of our democratic institutions and their lawmaking capacity. We need to have good quality and effective engagement if we want to move beyond just the aggregation of political preferences into an experience where decision-making is made among free and equal citizens, where their concerns are able to be heard and valued. So this is one of the motivations behind the work that the International Parliamentary Engagement Network, the IPEN, has been doing around steps to successful public engagement. And obviously, there's a wide range of tools and strategies that can be employed by parliaments to improve public engagement. And the suitability of each of these tools is going to vary depending on whether you're looking to engage from the position of a parliamentary committee, or whether you're an education officer looking to engage with a school group in an education context, or whether you're a parliamentary library researcher looking to prepare materials that can be used by elected members themselves. All of these different sites of engagement are going to demand different tools. But in any engagement strategy, it's this preparation stage that is going to be very significant, and also the evaluation at the end, so that it's possible to learn about what works in the future. This question of why we are engaging is really very central and often skipped over, but it can define all of the other choices in the planning for engagement. And when we get to the challenge of how to engage the disengaged, it can be really important to have a look at case studies that have been tried elsewhere. And forums just like this one and IPEN are starting to collect this treasure chest of amazing examples. Just yesterday, that committee session, we heard about fantastic Instagram opportunities to engage with young people in a parliamentary committee inquiry. We've seen how things like e-petitions can help invest the committee process with a different pathway for citizens to raise issues and concerns. We've heard about one-on-one interviews with hospital patients in big thematic committee inquiries into health policy, for example. Overseas, we've seen software that can help distill social media post messaging, so that instead of being overwhelmed by thousands and thousands of Facebook posts, it's possible to use software to distill some of the key themes from an engagement like that. And that's been employed successfully in the UK, for example. We've seen overseas in places like Brazil, the use of legislative tracking apps where citizens are engaged in providing real-time feedback on the design of legislation through an app, and are able to communicate with their elected representatives on the floor of Parliament, if you like. And this played out in some of the COVID emergency response environment. It obviously has risks and benefits, this kind of digital tool, but it provides a very direct connection between representative and community member. We've heard already in this conference, about the opportunities and challenges around accepting non-traditional forms of submissions to committee inquiries, including artistic submissions and audio-visual content. We've seen the use of online polling and plebiscites play out in the Australian context around the marriage equality debate, for example, but also in many other committee inquiries, as well as some of the other deliberative and direct democracy innovations that have been led mainly by governments so far, but are featuring in the UK Parliament environment around citizen juries and mini publics. There's also some interesting technology that's developed out of Europe, and in particular Germany, that enables communities to problem solve on policy questions online without moderation, that can then be fed into committee inquiries and other parliamentary processes as a form of evidence for them to reflect on. Each of these different strategies needs to be planned with care and put through one of these strategies that the IPEN has developed, that's my argument anyway, that if we want to check whether or not we're doing something good quality rather than just something new, we have to plan at the beginning and we have to reflect at the end through evaluation. Some of the challenges that you'd be aware of much more than me around these different forms of engagement also prompt us to do that planning and evaluation. And this question of who's leading and what's political is really powerful. And again, a theme that's come through in the presentations I've had the privilege of listening to in this conference. So it can help us to think about these challenges from a bigger picture perspective, because if the decisions around selection of engagement tools are being made by the committee chair, they might be different than if those decisions are being made by a committee secretariat staff. And they might be different if they're being made by a centralised digital engagement team, for example, compared to an individual aligned with a committee. Now, each institution's going to have a different perspective on which one of those roles best suits them. And we heard a really interesting example from the New Zealand experience around how they're engaging with researchers in their committee. But thinking about these questions at the beginning and the end of the engagement can help us collect this treasure chest of examples that we can share across jurisdictions. And if we are planning and evaluating, we start to be able to collect information that helps us think about things like, okay, if we're going to do a social media campaign to help promote our committee inquiry, is it better to use a short video clip from the chair rather than a text-based post? And if it is, can we record that in a really efficient, effective way and learn from what another jurisdiction's done? These small things can have a big impact on the quality of responses that you get back, and also on the ability to be able to plan for effective engagement in the future. So how might we evaluate public engagement? This is where I'm hoping the IPEN toolkit might be able to help you and might be able to be developed further in your institutional context to something that could help all of the staff that are involved in engagement to plan and measure their success, and can be linked to institutional strategic priorities as well as individual key performance indicators. It's really important that the evaluation isn't just focused on quantitative data, such as how many people participated, but that it seeks out qualitative feedback, not just from the perspective of, say, the Parliamentary Committee, but also from the perspective of the person that they engaged with. And actually, our educational specialists in Parliament that are speaking in the next session, I think later this afternoon, are the perfect people to understand this, because when they interact and engage with students, they are very familiar with seeking that feedback around how the experience went from the student perspective and capturing that data. And that's often missing from other forms of public engagement, including from committees, to ask afterwards what the experience was like. Did that set the person off on a positive engagement journey? And also this last question of impact. And this is the part that excites me as an academic, because on impact, this is where external independent research can also really help parliaments, because we might be able to take a comparative view or a longer term view of the impact of different engagement strategies. That's what I tried to do to some extent with my PhD, looking at counterterrorism law. I know that other scholars have done that when it comes to things like rights protection, to look across a parliament or a number of jurisdictions and be able to say, look, engaging in this way can have this impact on the law or can have this impact on policy settings. And if we do this, we start to be able to really achieve those overall goals of improving quality and diversity of engagement in a way that enhances the reputation of the democratic institution. So some practical ideas for the questions that you might want to ask at the beginning of your engagement strategy and then reflect on at the end are up here on this slide and also contained in the IPEN toolkit. And the toolkit has a number of interactive features on the website, is freely available. This is the one that sets it out in just one page, and can be a useful kind of reminder or a set of prompts for when you're having that conversation with the committee chair, for example, about how you're going to set up an engagement strategy. You know, what are the different steps that you're going to have to undertake, and how can you plan to get some of that qualitative feedback back from the people that you're engaging with? And then how can you share that with others? The New South Wales Parliament has recently done a fantastic paper about the work of their parliamentary committees that contains the type of information that's so useful for others. And I understand the New Zealand Parliament has done something similar. This is the type of exchange of information that academics can assist with, and that the IPEN can assist with as well. And in fact, even this afternoon at 5:30, the IPEN is running a free online seminar across a global seminar that's looking at the digital engagement strategies by committees in the UK. So what's next in this space? Well, what I would really like to do is to do an Australian-based project, possibly with our excellent neighbours in New Zealand, to really start to be able to collect some examples of best practice of engagement for different settings and by different bodies within parliaments, and to test how this toolkit might work as a planning tool and evaluation tool in Australian parliaments, particularly when it comes to embracing digital innovations, so that parliaments can make informed choices that include important risk management strategies as well before they invest in or experiment with digital engagement techniques. And so I'm actively seeking partners to do this project, possibly with the Australian Research Council linkage grant. And at the moment, we've got strong interest from the Australian Senate, the University of Leeds, and the House of Commons in the UK. So if anyone here is interested in finding out more about that project, please get in touch. And also, if you'd like to have a little play with the toolkit, you can visit the IPEN website. We also have a very fun online escape room game that is a way for people to play with some of these ideas in a relaxed and fun way. So that's all from me. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that really interesting and comprehensive paper, Sarah. We'll now move on directly to Rachel. So welcome aboard, Rachel. Looking forward to hearing what you have to tell us.
Thank you, Ken. Let me just start by sharing my slides. Just bear with me 1 second. All right. Everyone see my slides?
Yes.
All right, cool. All right, let's just kick this off. Kia ora and good afternoon, everyone. I would like to start off by saying a big, huge thank you to the ASPG Victorian chapter and its team members for inviting me and allowing me to share my research and doing an awesome job at organizing the conference. So without further ado, my name is Rachel. I am a PhD candidate from Te Piringa Faculty of Law at the University of Waikato in New Zealand, and the topic of my thesis is regulating social media environments. Are existing laws sufficient? Is criminalizing hate speech the way forward for New Zealand? So forming an integral part of my thesis is the exploration of social media platforms' duty of care. I explore Facebook and Instagram, now known as Meta, Twitter and TikTok. Why? Because they are trendy social media platforms that have a huge impact on its users. So that's basically what I'm going to be talking about today, and I will try to be as concise as I can, but because I'm not intending to go into much detail in today's presentation, as most of it is discussed in the paper. So social media. Social media usage has proliferated over the past decade with an approximate 2.95 billion reported users worldwide as of last year. To many people, social media brings a form of like escapism, and especially in times of COVID, the pandemic, it serves as a means to communicate with loved ones, with friends. It's also a method of forming connections. So as we can see, online hate speech is on the rise, especially after the March 15, 2019 terror attacks on the Muslim community here in the city of Christchurch. And social media platforms, played an important role during those attacks. And Facebook and Twitter, came under public scrutiny on whether it had done enough to stop all harm that arose from its live streams. Where are we in New Zealand? New Zealand is at a point of inflection right now when it comes to updating its laws to combat online hate speech. And the manner statutory duty of care is proposed as law for the regulation of online hate speech in online platforms will be explored briefly in two jurisdictions, namely the UK and Australia. So how intermediaries regulate online hate speech? First off, what is an internet intermediary? It is an entity that provides services that enables people to use the internet. And there are basically two classes, a conduit, which are basically technical providers of internet, and a host. Internet service providers are examples of conduit intermediaries. Facebook and social media, the rest of social media, would be examples of hosts. So this diagram shows the relationship between social media platforms and internet service providers. Social media, as you can see, is given an atmosphere to function within an internet service provider. There are current default mechanisms such as censorships, geo-blocking, web filters, and takedown notices in place that can curtail online hate speech. There are also other mechanisms in place that are, basically such as hate speech hotlines and self-regulations. And how do we, what is self-regulation? Self-regulation is basically implemented codes of conduct for its users, its members. And we also see this terminology, community guidelines. So examples of offenses that may contravene community guidelines are like cyberstalking, misusing intellectual property, and of course, objectionable content in which hate speech, online hate speech falls under. It is important to have community guidelines in place so that it ensures that social media is safe for us. So now the question is whether conduit intermediaries should also share accountability, right? And the duty of care in the social media sphere, as social media platforms are like a form of internet intermediaries, it is important to examine their response. And it is therefore significant to consider the concept of duty of care and apply it to social media, as well as ascertain if there is a need to impose a statutory duty of care, as developed in other areas of law, such as commercial and consumer law. The European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, said that there ought to be a legal framework that would stipulate the responsibility for the manner internet intermediaries operate. And this clearly indicates the European Union's position that social media platforms should take more accountability and embrace a duty of care approach. Now, we'd like to refer to Donahue and Stevenson, and it's a landmark case from tortious law that may shed some light and context with what we're trying to address here. In context with social media, the duty of care extends to the end user, and reasonable care must be given. So breaking down the landmark judgment from Donahue and Stevenson, it can be deduced that Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok are all products, albeit developed by software engineers for the usage of the end user, the consumer. So analogously, there is an implied duty of care that exists between social media platforms with its users. Now, where there are benefits in a statutory duty of care, there are also concerns for it, especially when it involves self-regulation. The effects of having a standard across the board would mean that it ought to be articulated as a one-size-fits-all, resulting in no standard liability in specific cases. And aside from providing takedown notices, censorships in place, there ought to be more proactive measures to remove illegal content online by social media platform. So draw attention to this screenshot. Self-regulation by content hosts has become prevalent in social media, as demonstrated in this screenshot. It depicts RNZ being a Facebook host, a host on Facebook, sorry, self-regulating its comment section. And RNZ does so on the basis of New Zealand's Harmful Digital Communications Act 2015. So as a content host, RNZ initiated switching off posts that had the likelihood of generating either abusive or harmful comments. And RNZ also draws reference to Facebook's community guidelines when taking these actions, therefore taking on an active role to self-regulate its content on Facebook, pursuant to social media platform policies. This also indicates a further duty of care taken on by content hosts, albeit not statutory one. So even though there are attempts to reduce the presence of online hate speech by self-regulation, there is no statutory obligation at any level within social media sphere, from the ISPs all the way to the end users. Very briefly, the UK recognized that while there is a moral duty of care that exists, a statutory duty of care did not. And this led to the introduction of a bill called the Online Harm Reduction Bill, which was drafted in 2019. And it basically proposed a comprehensive framework imposing new statutory duty of care onto social media platforms, obligating people, corporate entities, and organizations to obey statutory provisions. And so basically the bill proposes the formation of a separate and independent body to be regulator vis-a-vis the Office of Communications, Ofcom. So it's a separate agency, which is tasked to make codes of practice pursuant to statutory duty of care regime. And just a quick update, this bill is currently awaiting its second reading in the House of Lords. And the criticism I see from this bill is basically, the gist of it is that it's introduction of statutory duty of care is that the liability systems were not developed with the current state of the online environment in mind. So the requirement for statutory duty of care should be reviewed and be redesigned and adjusted according to the online environment. Now, the next example is Australia. In Australia, developed this Australian Code of Practice on Disinformation and Misinformation. So it's in a joint effort to combat online harms. We have the likes of Google, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and Microsoft that sign on a code that is governed by the Australian legislation. And this code, aptly called the Australian Code of Practice on Disinformation and Misinformation, was formulated by an independent body called the Digital Industry Group, DG. And this is one of kind, first ever in the world. In addition to the code, Australia's federal parliament enacted the Online Safety Act, which came to force early this year, 21st January to be exact, to improve and to promote online safety. And the Act furnishes existing laws Australia has pertaining to online safety, making it more expansive and stronger. And amongst many changes, the Online Safety Act introduces also the creation of a role of an e-safety commissioner to act as a government regulatory agency. This is the first of its kind, as I said, it's first of its kind in this world. We don't even see that in Europe. So the removal of harmful and illegal material is determined by the e-safety commissioner, who has the power to disable access. And in taking a holistic approach to things, the new act will make it mandatory for online platforms to develop new codes. And when these codes are registered, these codes will in turn make the online industry obligated to act on illegal content. Criticism, too much discretionary power and reliance on one entity. But that's still new. We shall see. It sounds like a really good thing going on, and I'm looking forward to seeing its progress. So what about New Zealand? There are no expressive legislations pertaining to hate speech laws in New Zealand. The following statutes you see here are referred to and basically have the capacity to regulate hate speech. And the law in New Zealand that gives us the fundamental human right to freedom of expression is the Bill of Rights Act. We see that the Harmful Digital Communications Act provides protection against online hate speech. We have 10 communication principles to adhere to, and Principle 8 pertains to online hate speech. Human Rights Act, on the other hand, is the heading that is relevant to this is inciting racial disharmony. And what's interesting is that there's a criminal provision for it and there's a civil provision for it. And it's all over the place, basically. So what we need to do is, while I acknowledge the government's efforts, in trying to update our laws, it is in my humble view that we should take a holistic approach and perhaps look at how Australia is handling this, and even counterparts in Europe as well. So it was also highlighted in the Christchurch call at the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism that there is a need to take further steps to avoid online harm, which include imposing a duty of care onto social media platforms. And according to Helen Clark Foundation, it recommends that social media businesses invest in and take reasonable steps to prevent harm. And these may include strengthening their technology, AI responses, and also beefing up their terms of service. It also proposed a regulatory agency to oversee and monitor the social media business. So New Zealand needs to develop and introduce a statutory framework to combat online harm. So in conclusion, learnings from other jurisdictions indicate that a collective duty of care can help alleviate online hate speech and in turn protect our users from harm that arises from illegal content. Illegal content in the social media sphere primarily. And from a critical point of view, introducing a duty of care onto social media platforms that have some level of self-regulation already potentially act as an appendage to laws enacted from a different era. and also as proposed by the online safety bill, harms for which a duty of care will obligate social media companies to action on should be listed. So it should be listed down and be more specific. And it is also important for a statutory duty of care to be imposed onto social media companies in order to ensure that more responsibility and accountability are in place, making it a safe and healthy environment for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for that really interesting paper that you've given and the analysis that you've, I've been told to start my video. There we are. Thank you very much, Rachel, for that really interesting paper and for the analysis that you've given us on this notion of a duty of care. It's certainly something that's long been of interest to me. While we're waiting for people to put their hands up, can I pose my question, which I'd like to put to Sarah? And that is, how do we persuade the decision makers in the federal parliament, all the more so in the context of the current election, to introduce these sorts of deliberative processes into the way in which the federal parliament operates? My observation has been pretty disappointing in that respect. I know that when Alana McTiernan, the Western Australian, was a member of the House of Representatives, and Craig Laundy, a Liberal from Sydney, was a member of the House of Representatives, they both tried to develop these themes, these ideas for application at the federal level, and unfortunately it fell on deaf ears, which may be the reason that both of them elected to leave the federal parliament and go back to other things. So, Sarah, I'm wondering if you've got any comment or information from other jurisdictions, perhaps, in how best to interest and provide incentives to members of the federal parliament to use these types of processes.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. I share that feeling. I mean, often it's very easy to be cynical and skeptical about the extent to which any of these processes can possibly hope to compete with partisan political interests and incentives. But on the other hand, when we look at some examples from Australia and overseas, we can see opportunities for innovation, sometimes in surprising places. And also we can see conventional strategies with some tweaking making a big difference. So to give you an example, if you've got a topic that's less capital P political, it's a great opportunity for innovation and engagement. So there was a crossbows inquiry in South Australia that enabled a bit of innovation around going out and seeking some perspectives from people who use crossbows and trying different things in that inquiry that had less of that high profile political level. On the other end of the spectrum, we can see that when it comes to big issues like that are highly politicized, like marriage equality, if we take a long-term view of the way the committees, multiple committees engage with the community on that topic and their use of things like online polling and then a plebiscite, we see that a combination of strategies, even though each individual committee hearing might not be perfect, when you look across the spectrum of different techniques, you can see the value in the different things that they tried. But overseas, we're really seeing the innovations come to the fore. So the local government level is another great site for innovation, where we've seen things like community members taking pictures of the playgrounds they want to see on their phone, sending it into local council, and this develops a plan, but also taking this up a notch into things like aged care and hospitals. So capturing a range of different digital forms of information about what people in aged care homes want to see in terms of service and care. But some of the other innovations overseas have been really future looking at these wicked policy problems like climate change and transition to low carbon economies. That's when we've seen multiple committees in the UK Parliament get together to host these citizen juries to be able to develop an outcome there. So I think we can look overseas for inspiration, but at home, we've also got examples recently where small things make a difference. So the COVID Senate committee, for example, also highly politicised, obviously didn't make a big dent in the laws, but their practice of publishing the responses from ministers very quickly to questions on notice online, and the ability for people to subscribe to that, meant that journalists and advocacy groups were getting real-time information about questions to ministers on COVID when Parliament wasn't sitting at all. So it provided a very important scrutiny opportunity, even by making that information available in that way. And over in Perth, we've seen a group called Millennium Kids present, this is young kids, school-age kids, be able to interact with parliamentary committees through showcasing their approach to grassroots climate activity. And so young people are very naturally interested in some of these innovations. And when that's combined with something like education officers, which we've seen in places like Scotland, we can see that we set a whole family up to engage well when we show a school-age child how to develop and interact with the Parliament. So I'm very optimistic that we have these green shoots showing up. And I think we don't need a committee to go full Monty digital. We just need to complement what committees are already comfortable with some small evidence-based innovations. And when we're able to say, look how New South Wales did it, it wasn't expensive, it wasn't too risky, you could try it here. Or when we can say, think about what Scotland did, they did it in this way and actually saved committees time down the track. I think that's the way we need to encourage people to try these things.
Thank you very much, Sarah. We've got a question on the Q&A from Anja, and Anja asks, given Elon Musk's statements on his vision for Twitter regarding freedom of speech, what success do you think will come? So perhaps Rachel, if you'd like to respond to that, please.
It's a very good question, Anya. Elon Musk's statement, yes, I did read that he was interested in what is this moderation on Twitter, but his focus at that time was to make sure that the user experience is a lot better. So I don't know what that means, but in terms of freedom of expression, we've got to also look at whether that is in context with a US, canvas, because we have a different sort of perspective in that as well. How, we don't involve the Senate and things like that. But it is going to be an interesting time when, the takeover by Elon Musk becomes true. And I don't know whether it's going to be a really good thing. I hope it is going to be a good thing. One can only be hopeful.
Thanks for that response. I don't see any hands up or other questions on the Q&A. Has anyone got a question that they would like to pose? Well, it seems not. So I'll give a last opportunity for closing comments to Sarah and then to Rachel. And Sarah, in your comments, I wonder if you can reflect on the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the proposal for a voice to Parliament as something that your paper is relevant to. So firstly, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, the Uluru Statement is an example of a macro shift in the way that parliaments might engage with First Nation people through this voice to Parliament model. And it's been of great interest to international scholars and practitioners, and the IPEN had a whole workshop involving some of the Aboriginal leaders who were involved in developing and consulting on that Uluru Statement. And so that kind of innovation, I guess, is a way to recognise that point about we need to think about empowering the people that have been disengaged and relinquishing some control over a process in order to get the best quality engagement and with benefit for everyone. So I think that model would send a powerful message to Parliament in Australia and around the world. At the state level, we're also seeing innovations and experimentation with the way that First Nations people are interacting with the Parliament. Sometimes that comes with treaty, and for some Aboriginal and First Nations people, treaty is extremely important component, and that's something that's really highlighted in the Uluru Statement. But a voice to Parliament would provide an institutional mechanism for engagement that's empowered engagement, where the community that's speaking to Parliament has some control over the process of engagement as well as the substantive agenda. And that's really what it's about. If you want to have a relationship of trust and the type of relationship that will improve the quality of the policy and the quality of the law, there has to be a recognition of the status of that public that you're engaging with. And, you know, the Uluru Statement is really a generous opportunity from the perspective of First Nations people for the rest of Australia to think about that. And I'm I'm really hopeful that we will continue to have those discussions at a federal level in Australia. And I think showcasing the work in different state jurisdictions is so important. The work that's being done in Victoria, for example, sharing that with other parliaments and looking to see how New Zealand has enabled some of those empowered positions, and critically reflecting on whether they do deliver the type of empowered engagement that First Nations peoples deserve is also important.
Thank you very much for those comments, expanding on what you had to say earlier. Much appreciated. Rachel, if you'd like to make some closing comments, please.
Yeah, sure. So I think the key takeaway from my presentation is just basically a holistic approach, and to try to introduce a statutory duty of care onto social media platforms. I know a lot of people want to talk about freedom of expression as well, which is key, but we also need to look at giving some responsibility and accountability on social media platforms. It's one to have legislations in place. We see in France, in Germany, who developed some very crafty legislation recently, but it's just too 1984 for a lot of people. So we don't want to get there. However, I do think, as highlighted, I do favor the approach by Australia's approach, basically having a separate entity to monitor social media, because currently in New Zealand, anything objectionable goes through the censorship board. So, we want to maybe try to update our laws a little bit. But yeah, that's it for me, Ken. Thank you.
Okay, well, that just confirms the value of conferences like this, where information can be put by someone from one jurisdiction to help inform and motivate someone from another jurisdiction. So thank you very much for that. We now break for lunch for 1 hour. Thank you very much, everyone who participated in this session. I look forward to continuing the conference after lunch.